Okay, everyone, Mickey's coming on in. So welcome to lesson number 7, Lessons from Church History. We're back again. I feel like I'm getting more in the groove. I've adjusted to the time change again and ready to go tonight. Tonight, we're going to do just one individual in a certain period of time, and it's called Augustine. St. Augustine, if you're of an inclination, and so we'll get started with that. For those that are, got to get this working. Yeah. For those of you, we're going to talk about confession tonight. All right. And confession comes from the Latin confiteri, or fatere, which means to acknowledge or to admit. Now, so just get that in your mind, what that means. So tonight, if you want to get a hold of me, here's that information up there. If you got confessions, comments, or questions, if you're live, send them to Jesse Black at 469-267-9130. If you're recording and you're watching this later, we'll just give it an email or make a comment on YouTube. Well, everybody will see it there if you do that, or the Church Center app. And we do a lot of stuff through the Church Center app, put resources out there and such. Now I have a confession to make. First is, I lied. All right. And there will be no Jerome or Pelagius, if I spelled that name tonight, right? Tonight. And I think I had advertised that we were going to try to cover that. And I quite frankly got into this thing and I said it's too rich. And we're going to talk about St. Augustine for some time tonight. Now, some people will say that it's Augustine as well, too. I've heard that, but I've never used that. So for me, it's Augustine, and we can just kind of go from there. Some get very particular about how they pronounce that, and I'm like, no, I'm not hung up on that. So from the mailbag, a little bit of this. First of all, Jennifer Pettit last time asked, what's a Copt? All right, and I don't know if I thoroughly explained that. A Copt is a race of people, just like what is a Frenchman or what is a German. A Copt is a particular race of people that live in Africa, North Africa, around basically the Nile River Valley, and they kind of run up through that area, and that's what a Copt is. Kathy and I had a month or so a chance to visit the Coptic Church, which is a very ancient church, and very interesting things that they have. They don't believe what you and I believe. They still believe in Jesus Christ, but there are some other things that they will have differences that we have on that, and they definitely have a different kind of worship service than what we had. And if they went to our worship service, they go like, you guys aren't worshiping God. So that's the Copt. And we went there. Kathy and I walked out, and I said, well, do you feel like you went to church? And she said, yes, I did. And I said, I feel like I went to a history lesson. And that was about right. Now, Jennifer also confessed that she uses instant pudding. So I just want to get that out there. For those of you that need to know that, she uses instant pudding. Now, Cat Music had asked and said to me, he said, I would like to do a deep dive in theology and why we hold the Trinitarian view. And so basically, I viewed that as a confession. I viewed that as a confession that he really wants to lose his mind. And I redirected him back to this slide from Augustine of Hippo, since we're covering him tonight. And he said, he who denies the Trinity is in danger of losing his salvation. He who tries to understand the Trinity is in danger of losing his mind. Now, that being said, I've had some similar thoughts about having a deep dive or for further discussion session. And so I just want to see if there's interest in that. Contact me and let me know. And then also what you would like to do. So like this is one that Kat had said he would really like to talk more about theology in the sense of who is God, who is Jesus, and what does that mean. And I can tell you that there are numerous opinions, and they're all held even today. So you can go from Arianism to Nestorianism, and you can kind of go on and on, that they are all over the place. Most of the Western Christianity, Protestant Christianity, is going to hold to a Trinitarian viewpoint, and a lot of us because of things that happened in the 4th century AD, which is the time period that we're covering. All right, so what's on the docket tonight? I usually like to do this to give you what's ahead. Aurelius Augustinus, and that's it. That's all we're going to talk about tonight. All right, so I asked Robin here a few minutes ago, I said, what do you know about Augustine? She says, very little. I said, one of Keith's favorite quotes is from Augustine, but I know that. And I said, well, after an hour, you're going to say, I wished I would not have asked or left or something. So we are going to do this. I've had quite a time getting this information. If you go out and do internet searches or web searches or whatever else, you can find a ton of information. I mean, a ton of information on Augustine. Jesse and I listened to Great Courses. Yeah, Great Courses. And there was one just on the City of God. And it was 28 sessions on the City of God. And they were probably 45 minutes each. And it's a college level course. And you can take courses just on his books. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But first of all, words of the week. I got rid of Gus Gnosis because we're in Latin, and we're going to talk about Latin Logan, who's going to give us a deeper understanding. Now, this is my chance to brag on my grandson. He's taking Latin at Providence Academy, and he's got to be the top student over there. And the reason that you know he's the top student, the teacher kind of failed to show up one day or was late to show up, and Logan stood up and started teaching the class Latin. All right, and he is, in fact, when they have the contest in class, they have handicapped him and said, Logan, you can't do X, Y, Z or something like that, because if he's on your team, you're winning. So Latin Logan's going to give us the meanings tonight. So the first one, and these are going to come up later, is chastity. Most people know what that means. It's from the Latin castus, which means to cut off, separated or pure, and it's a root for the English word castrated. So you ever think about chastity and castrated, they're meaning the same thing. All right? Because how would you maintain, if you were a male, how would you maintain chastity? You become castrated. So that's kind of a word that it came across, and I go, okay, that's real interesting. Next one is continence, and this is something that we don't typically use, and it's not incontinence, Mickey, so if you can't go to the whatever. I don't know why I thought about Mickey when I thought about that, but but Constance is from Constance is from the Latin continent, which I thought was real interesting. Anyway, meaning self-restraint or to maintain self-control, especially in regard to sex. All right, and you're going to see some of the things that comes on there. Where are we talking about? So Augustine was from this area right here, Hippo and Carthage. He's actually from a small town there called Thagaste, and that's a kind of it's a farming community, for lack of a better word. It's probably a very medium or smallish size farming community. This was a huge, huge farming area during those times, and so a lot of things that went to the rest of the Roman Empire came out of North Africa. I'm also going to look at Milan. Yep, up there, and Milan is in Italy, and he spends quite a bit of time in Milan, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But just to get a view on this, as you look at this map and you think about where Carthage is, and you go, that is not that far from Rome, from Italy. And you always think about, oh, it's over in Western North Africa, and it's not really. It's in Central North Africa. And so they have a lot of influence, and this would have been a Latin-speaking area, and so that is what Augustine does that. So who was him? Well, first of all, I want to talk about this book, The Confessions, all right? And for those online, here you go. This is a book called Confessions. It's one of his 3 most famous books. We'll talk about this. This book was the first of its kind, all right? He invented an autobiography in this book. And he tells about his entire life. And that's why you have a ton of information. And like other books, you can go through and study just him off of this book. And it's fascinating. And that's the first thing, it's an autobiography. The second thing is, it's exactly what it says. It's Confessions. As an old bishop, okay, because he's going to live into his, I think about late 70s. As an older bishop, he writes this book remembering what he was like as a youth. And so you have young Augustine and old Augustine remembering these things, and he goes through, and it's a prayer to God. So he's confessing his life to God, and it is a fascinating read. And what little I've got to read it, I just got engrossed in it, and I said, I got to get my lesson ready, and so I had to put it down. And but you can see I've got bookmarks and page marks and everything else in there. Now, that's the first thing. Second thing is, if you get one of these books and decide that you want to pick it up and read it, be very, very careful about what edition you get, because it has been translated into English for the last 400 or 500 years, among other languages. And you can get one that will read these and thous, and you think you picked up a King James language. And so that's one of the things I'd say, just be a little careful. If you do going to pick one up, pick up a really good copy. I recommend this one. And I don't remember who did this, but that's one that I would recommend that you get. And pretty much everything that we're going to talk about, not everything, most of what we're going to talk about tonight is going to come right out of this book about his confessions and as we walk through Augustine's life. All right, so as I mentioned, he was born in Thagaste, and I had to ask Logan how you pronounce that, and he told me, and so I was like, okay, good. I don't know if it's right or not, but that's what it is. 354, so we're talking about the latter part of the 4th century, and he's going to live into the 5th century, and so we'll see some of that. He's going to witness or be not a witness, but he's going to be there at the time that Rome gets sacked in 410. So he'll be in his 60s or 50s when Rome gets sacked, and that's when he's going to start writing The City of God, and this is the other book, The City of God. I've made it about halfway through. I don't know if you can see where my marker is, but I've made it about halfway through this. This is actually a book of 22 books put together, and it took him, I think, 13 years to write the book, and so it was a response to the destruction of the city of Rome, and he's going to contrast that book. I'm probably giving away something later in the slide. He's going to contrast that book, the city of man, Rome, versus the city of God, which is what we look forward to. And the church, even today, and that would be the city of God that he makes that contrast on. And he sets so many things straight in this book. To say he was a deep thinker isn't saying enough. He was a deep thinker, but he was also a very progressive thinker in how you would put things together, and we'll see some of that tonight. His parents were Patricius and Monica, and you might know her as Saint Monica, or if you go out to California, you'll see Santa Monica, and we'll talk more about her. His dad was not a Christian. His mother was, and he will attribute a lot of times him being a Christian to his mother. In 366, so he's 12 years old, he starts to get a classical Latin education, and his parents sacrificed that for him. He was a very bright kid, and so they saw that and they sacrificed that, and they sent him to school to get a classic education. And in fact, he got a sponsorship from somebody else that was in the area because they thought he was so good, so they basically gave him a scholarship, sent him away at 12 years old, and one of the things he got was rhetoric. And you can imagine the art of being a rhetorician is going to go far. And I would say this to parents: if you can get your kid to learn how to speak fluently in public, they will go far. And so are your grandkids. We put so much emphasis on the sciences, math, and whatever else, chemistry or whatever else. But if you know all that stuff and you can't communicate it to anybody, you're in trouble. And I think I've tried to emphasize that to my kids, probably not to the best of my abilities, but it's one of those things that public speaking, not just standing up in front like this, but even communicating one-on-one and sitting down and talk to somebody, is a skill and an art, and it can be learned. And I see that Xander's sitting over here, and so Xander, I would encourage you to take speaking, communication, whatever else you can do on that. All right. So early on, he read the scriptures, because obviously his mother would have those, or I don't know, she wouldn't have those, but she would encourage him to read the scriptures. And so he gave it a go, and he read the scriptures, but he rejected them because he was too proud to understand their simple words, and that was what he does in his confession. So when I quote something like that, and you have to think about, he's getting this classic Latin education, and so he's reading Plato, and he's reading, these other authors, and they're so eloquent. And then he goes to read Paul or one of the Gospels, and they're simpletons. And in fact, if you would have read, he would know Greek. If you read this stuff and you're reading that common language, they're just a bunch of fishermen. And that's kind of what he would do. And so from a classical education standpoint, He looked at that and goes like, these guys don't have it together. You know, why do I want to read these guys? Because their language is so crude. In fact, you go read some of Paul's writings, you're going to find a lot of things that are crude in there, very much in the common language of things. All right, so when he's about 17, he's going to leave and go to Carthage. And that's where he says he will participate in a cauldron of illicit loves. I'll let you guys fill the blank in on that. Augustine had a big hang up with sex, and I'll just kind of leave it there for right now. But he was something about that. While he's there, he said he frequented the theater, and he had a group of buddies called the Wreckers, and they would go out and carousing and doing whatever else and partying on the town, and you can imagine. So you start to get the idea that, hey, this guy sounds like he could live in America today, probably function just fine. Now, while in that time, he fathers a son named Adeodatus, which means beloved of God, I think is what that means. And his concubine, he's got her girlfriend basically, and so he never names her, and she's his common law wife. And I want to mention one other book tonight, and I just picked this book up. And so you got Confessions, the Confessions, and in the Confessions he talks about this concubine, is what they say, but it's pretty much a common law wife. And so there was a lady named Suzanne Wolfe that heard about him when she was a young girl, and she said, who is his wife? And they said, her name is lost to history. We have no idea who she is. And so she later on became an author and decided to write a fiction book called The Confessions of X. And it's a fictional story from the standpoint of this concubine. And I can't wait to read it and get to see what she takes on it. This book, by the way, won the Christian Book of the Year in 2017. So it's a Christian book from what I've been told, and did that. So it won some kind of award like that. But while he's also in Carthage, he becomes a Manichae. All right, and we may have heard of that. Did we talk about Manichaeism yet? Okay, so we're going to talk about Manichaeism. All right, so Manichaeism was founded by the prophet Mani in 216 to 272. And Manichaeism was a huge and popular religion of the day. And it rivaled Christianity in terms of size and popularity, especially in this North Africa part. And he becomes a disciple of Manichaeism. And it takes a lot of its beliefs from Judaism, Zoroastrian, and Buddhist influence. Zoroastrian is modern day Iran. So it was the belief they had that when Christianity started moving to the east, that was what they came in conflict with, was Zoroastrianism. And it's virtually gone today. Judaism obviously is still around, and Buddhist influence, but Mani was from that area, and so he brings that over and does it. And it's basically a blend of Gnostic, Neoplatonist belief about the lesser nature of material reality. And so what he would say, Mani would say, God is a material, visible thing called light. Now you also look at that and think, what Jesus called the light? And so and the reason I want to mention this is because this is going to influence Augustine later on. He's got that part of the baggage in his thing, and he's going to take that with him when he goes on. Mani would also say the truth lies deeply inside in the innermost spiritual part of our being. All right. So, and they're going to emphasize contemplation. They'll have a deep suspicion of noise and turbulence. So they want to get inside. So you see that Eastern influence. They want to get inside and become Zen or whatever it is, that you can just kind of see that, and they're bringing that in. And is that not popular today? You still see Eastern influences that people want to do yoga and go namaste and do whatever like that. And there's a guy that Kathy and I were doing yoga with, and he would ring a bell, and I'm thinking, what in the world are you ringing the bell for? I'm just trying to stretch. So that's it. So that's their deep suspicion, noise of turbulence. But he says, behind this world, there is a truer, deeper one. Okay, buy that yet? So you look at this and go, okay, some appeal to this. And they resisted the idea that our sensory experience is exhaustive of all reality. You need a transcendental understanding to gain this, whatever it is. Sounds very Eastern religion to us, to me, to my ears. So Augustine becomes a Manichae. All right. Now let's go back to him because that's going to come in place. About this time, he's going to encounter Cicero as well. And he reads this book called Hortensius, and he became hooked on philosophy and wisdom. And also, Cicero counseled against the pursuit of sensual pleasure. That's an issue because he does not have any constraints on that, on his sensual pleasure, as you would go through that. So he went back home to Tagaste to teach grammar, and a friend of his in 376 basically gets sick and dies. And the way the story goes is this friend of his, a fellow Manichae, got sick and went unconscious, all right? And while he's unconscious, his friends baptize him as a Christian. Now, they had some views about baptism a lot of times that they would say, okay, this is what saves you. And so they would baptize people and think, now you've been baptized, you can be saved. And that's why you would see some of them waiting for a certain time before you're baptized because you want to make sure your sin's away from you. All right, and even Augustine's going to get caught into a little bit of that later on. Well, Augustine objected to that, and his friend recovers some, and Augustine basically thought his friends were wrong, and so he wanted the guy to recant. And he goes to the guy and he says, basically, the guy's on his deathbed. He's come back alive. He says, you don't believe what they did. They baptized you as a Christian. And the guy says, that's okay. He says, I want to basically hedge all my bets before I die. And Augustine had a huge, huge problem with that because he's like, no. Christianity's over there. We're over here. Never the two shall come together. All right. And so that's what he's going on with that. But this offers him no answers from Manichaeism because he's got this problem with this guy dying, and he's like, well, what's going to happen to this guy now that he's a Christian? And so he doesn't know what's going on with the guy. And so he's going to start looking for answers, and he starts asking questions, and he's pulling in Cicero and asking these questions that all his Manichae friends can't answer. So they said, we think you need to go talk to Faustus. Now, Faustus, we'll talk about Faustus a little bit. He was the Manichae bishop. Basically, he was the big dog now at the time, and he's coming to town. And Augustine will basically say in the book how he was waiting and was very patient waiting for Faustus. And when Faustus finally came to town, he took time before he ever could get to him one-on-one to start asking these questions. And after he asked these questions, Faustus didn't give him adequate answers. So he's kind of like, well, what now? This guy's, a bag of hot air. So we don't have a picture of Manichae, but I thought this guy represents the best based on what Augustine says. Okay? And he said about Faustus, he had acquired a fair command of the language, which was rendered more glib and seductive by his skillful management of what ability he had and a certain natural charm. Thus it came about that this Faustus, who was a death trap for many, unwittingly and without intending it, began to spring the trap for which I was caught. So basically he's saying, and I really do like Owen Wilson, by the way. I think he's a fantastic actor, and he just makes me laugh. All right, but if you listen to Owen Wilson, he goes on about these little inane things, and it's just, as he said, it's glib. And so he's saying he could sell an Eskimo an ice chest, and that's what he's saying, but he's got no depth to it. And so he said, but based on his conversation with Faustus, and he says, he began to spring a trap. In other words, I'm kind of leaving Manichaeism and going to something else. All right, so back to Augustine. So he's at home, and he's ready to get out of town again, all right? And so he ditches his mom in 383, and he heads to Rome to teach rhetoric with a friend of his, another Manichae friend of his. And they're leaving, and they're going to the big city. And so they go to Rome, and they're going to be there for about a year. And they get students. And so what was known at the time is you would go, if you were a teacher, you would go, and you would have a group of students, and you would teach them. So he's going to teach them rhetoric, or he's going to teach them Latin, arts or whatever it is. And so they would come to him like that, except for in the big city of Rome, these students skipped out when it's time to pay tuition. And you couldn't go find them. So they got free education, and Augustine was kind of pretty put out with that, but he had done a really good job of education. He started getting something of a reputation of being a good teacher. And maybe it was one of the kids' parents or something like that, but he gets this. So the prefect of Rome, which is a government official, chooses him for a post in Milan as a teacher of rhetoric. He couldn't have been more happy. So he goes to Milan, and there in the book he says, I came to Milan and Bishop Ambrose. And here's a picture of something that's standing in Milan today. And so he introduces Bishop Ambrose, and we know him, Ambrose of Milan, that we talked about previously. And why does he go to Ambrose? It's real interesting, so we're going to get into that. Anyway, so Augustine in Milan, about 385. The first thing he's going to do is he's going to study Plotinus, who's a Neoplatonist. And some people will call Augustine a Neoplatonist, or they will call him a Christian Platonist. And you will definitely hear things about Plato in his teaching. So, but that's it. So, and with Plotinus, basically, he said, one is awakened to a sense of divine destiny through purification from carnal appetites. So this is bugging him. This carnal appetite is bugging him and is following him through. And he says, no certainty about truth can ever be attained. There can only be a degree of probability. All judgments are thereby relative. Anybody hear that today? It sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's what a Neoplatonist would do, is basically everything is relative. Judgments are there. You can't really get to the truth. And so Augustine is presented with that. But he also goes to Ambrose's church. And basically he wants to learn rhetoric from a master, because Ambrose was a master rhetorician. And we talked about how he wasn't even a Christian. He was such a good rhetorician and a politician. And basically when the bishop was there, for those that weren't there, he basically was made bishop because he was such a great persuader. But he heard more than just rhetoric. He heard the good news of Jesus the Christ. And that's where you start going like, okay, now God's working on him. And that's what you'll hear about in his book. He'll say, basically, God, you knew all along you were working on me. And he'll do that. And then mom shows up. So, all right. Remember, he left her, and the story that he tells in here is basically he duped her into leaving. He said he was going to go out with his buddies, and instead he went out with his buddies and got on the boat and went to Rome, not telling her that he was leaving. And so it takes her a little while, but she finds him. So let's talk about Monica, all right? Santa Monica. And she is a formidable Catholic mother, and that's why I use that in all the best senses, all right? And what would you say about a formidable Catholic mother? She's going to put a heap load of guilt on you, and she's going to control you, and she's going to do this, and you're not going to do anything without her permission and everything else. Now, when he's a boy, she has big ambitions because she is a brilliant boy, and so she's looking for this, and so she has very, very deep ambitions for him. And she warned young Augie about fornication and adultery. He didn't listen. All right, so that's one of the things. And she also discouraged him about early marriage. And he says, depriving him of the most effective remedy against adolescent lust. All right, so let's go on. So here's what Augustine says on adolescence. Boys, pay attention. All right. He says this, I had been extremely miserable in adolescence, miserable from its onset. And I prayed to you, O God, for the gift of chastity. I had even pleaded, grant me chastity and continence, but please not yet. I was afraid you might hear me immediately and heal me of the morbid lust which I was more anxious to satisfy than to snuff out. And isn't that just a wonderful quote? And this is one of his most famous ones, what I've highlighted in yellow. Grant me chastity and continence, but please not yet. And isn't it that way with all of our sin? You start looking at that and you go like, God, I don't want to sin anymore, and so please stop me from sinning, but not yet because I got one more fling to do or one more whatever. And that's the way it is. And so you look at Augustine, and you say, man, what he just understood human nature and did that. So now he goes on. He says, now I want to call to mind the foul deeds I committed, those sins of the flesh that corrupted my soul, not in order to love them, but to love you, my God. Out of love for loving you, I do this, recalling my most wicked ways, and that you may grow ever sweeter to me. It says, there was a time in adolescence that I was afire to take my fill of hell. I boldly thrust out rank, luxurious growth in various furtive love affairs. What was it that delighted me? Only loving and being loved. And so you see Augustine talk about adolescence and his struggles that he had with that. Well, to his mother's delight, he has given up Manichaeism. All right, joy in the household. All right, so she is so happy that he's done this, but to her dismay, he's not a Christian yet either. All right, and so she's trying to arrange a marriage for him with a Christian heiress. Okay, the girl is only 10 years old. Now he is in 385, 30, about 30, almost 30 years old. And so she's going to arrange this marriage, all right, and does arrange the marriage like a good Catholic mother might do. But she's only 10, 2 years away from the acceptable age of marriage. And as a condition of the marriage, her parents said he's got to separate from his concubine, all right? So guess what happens? His concubine doesn't like the arrangement, so she leaves and goes back to Africa. Leaves him with a son there too, by the way. Now, does that solve Augustine's problems? And his answer is no. He has another fling, all right? And the book will tell you he has a load of guilt about his carnal appetites conflicting with his spiritual desires. And you have to think about Paul saying, why do I do what I do? All right? And so that's one of the things that Augustine does. So in 385, here's what happens with his conversion. There's a fellow that's from Africa named Ponticanus, and this is going to be small, so sorry about this. And he's visiting with Augustine, and he happens to pick up, and over on the table, he happens to pick up this book, basically. It's not really a book, it's writings. And it was the writings of Paul. Ponticanus looks at him and says, offers his congratulations, and he says to him, I am a baptized Christian and make a practice of prostrating myself before God. And so he just smiles at him and says, you're reading Paul. I'm a Christian. I would have never thought about that, Augustine. I mean, you nearly hear him say that in his thing. Well, Ponticanus goes on to tell them of Anthony of Egypt. Remember Anthony? St. Anthony? Anthony the monk? Anthony the one that started monasticism? And how he gave up his wealth to follow Jesus. He said, and Augustine says, I began to feel my heart burn in my breast with the power that the call was exerting on me. You never know who it is that's going to influence you for Christ. And you're going to have those things put into your life all along. Even if you have somebody from your past that's an old friend and he comes to visit, and all of a sudden you go like, you're a Christian? Or he says that, you're a Christian? And it's kind of like, some of us will go like, well, yeah, but, you know, and it's thing, don't ever be ashamed of being a Christian. It's one of the things that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But he's listening to this story of St. Anthony, all right? And Ponticanus is telling him that. And that's what makes it burn in his, because here is Anthony that gave up. He was wealthy, if you remember the story. He was wealthy, gave all he had to follow Christ. And Augustine is sitting there, what am I holding on to? So Augustine goes out into the garden and anguishes. He is upset with this because he is at conflict with himself. And he's like, what in the world have I got going on that this is happening? And while he's out there and he's just in anguish and he's out there, and then he hears a child's voice. He says, I don't know if it's a man or a boy or a girl. I don't know which. And it's kind of in a sing-song voice, and it says, pick up and read, pick up and read. And so he's like, what is this about? Pick up and read, pick up and read. He says, I've never heard a child chant that before. So he says, thinking about Anthony, so he goes inside, he picks up Paul's letter, and he reads. And he just happens to open up to Paul's letter to the church in Rome. And it says, this passage out of Romans 13, let us behave decently. And think about Augustine and his problem with the carnal problem. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the flesh. Could Augustine have heard a message that pierced his heart more than that? But not only the message, the yellow highlighted here, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ. And that was the thing that Augustine was missing. He never had put on that, he never had looked at the thing about how to put on Christ. You want to fix all your sin problems? Clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ. So, you can look at that as a conversion experience. Mom had some ideas too. It says, when we went indoors and told my mother, who was overjoyed, as you can imagine, because she's been praying for him since he was a little kid too. For she saw that you had granted her much more in my regard than she had begged of you in her wretched, tearful groaning. I stood there, no longer seeking a wife or entertaining any worldly hope, for you had converted me to yourself. In doing so, you had also converted her grief into joy, far more abundant than she had desired, and much more tender and chaste than she could have ever looked to find in grandchildren from my flesh. What a fantastic testimony from my mother, seeing her kids turning to Christ. Okay, finishing up the story. He and Mom decide to go back home, and on the way, Monica falls ill. All right, and with a fever, and she's going to die at the age of 56, and that kind of knocks a few more of the things out, the supports for him. So he's basically on his own now. But he eventually has to hang around Rome, and there was a civil war going on at the time, and that's why they couldn't get out and go, and she died there. So finally in 388, he's going to return to Thagaste, and he's shattered at the death of his son at age 17. So now he's presented with the death of his mother, the death of his son. His father, I believe, had already passed away, and so he's basically on his own. So he goes over to Hippo. And remember, Carthage and Hippo was over here, and the Bishop Valerius makes him a priest. And so he begins in 391 his prolific career as a Christian author. He succeeds Valerius as bishop when Valerius finally either steps down or dies. He's there for the sacking of Rome. He's down in Hippo for the sacking of Rome, and that's where he begins the city of God. It took him 13 years to complete that. A monk named Pelagius, Jesse wanted to know about Pelagius, he's fleeing Rome, and he ends up in Hippo. And so that's where Augustine and Pelagius get together. And that's where Augustine and Pelagius start butting heads. And there's lots of things, that Augustine will write that are in refutation to Pelagius. And so that's a very entertaining discussion to see some of the things that Pelagius presented and how it helped develop Augustine's theology and his teaching. He was present at the Council of Carthage in 200, where 200 bishops led by Augustine pronounced Pelagianism a heresy. In 426, he's going to retire as a bishop, and North Africa was ravaged by the Vandals, and so there's other things going on. And basically, the Vandals are at the gate of Hippo, and Hippo is a refugee city, and Augustine's going to die in his peace there. All right, let's talk about his legacy. I think I mentioned he is the most prolific writer of Christianity. All right, most people will say if Paul, they'll actually look at it and they'll say, here's Paul and what Paul wrote and its influence on Christianity. Augustine is going to build on that, and it's going to be a cathedral compared to what Paul laid down as foundation stones. And that's what's going to happen. He wrote more than 100 books, which is equivalent to a 300-page book every year for 40 years. You think about that. Writing a book, a 300-page book, would be a challenge. Writing that for 40 years ongoing. Now, he didn't do it over a period of 40 years, he just did. Just to name a few of the books, all right? let's go here. The letters of St. Augustine, the soliloquies of St. Augustine, the expositions of the books of Psalms. You want to just keep going? We can skip a few. All right. As I mentioned earlier, his three most, I don't even know what the right word to say is, known books are The City of God, on Christian doctrine, which I haven't got a chance to dive into that one yet, but I definitely want to. And then the Confessions, which we've talked about at length tonight. That's just to name a few. I think I counted this, and there's about 40 books up there. And he wrote well over 100. All right, so if we put them all up there, you couldn't read it, and you're probably not going to anyway. One guy had said, anybody that says they've read of all of St. Augustine's lying. All right, so that's it. All right, so let's talk a little more about his legacy. He emphasized the importance of reading and understanding Scripture. This is huge because this is going to change as you move through church history. Because remember, we talked about last week in terms of authority, and we're going to talk about the Western church, all right? What did the Roman Catholic Church say? They don't want you to read and understand Scripture. They want you to listen and obey what they teach. And so that's what he is. So he is that, this quote from him, "The most skillful interpreter of the sacred writings will be he who has read them all and retained them in his knowledge." And so that's a quote from him. St. Augustine, Florida is named. I had to look it up. I said basically the land was cited in 1565 near his feast day, and so they named it St. Augustine. Santa Monica, California, his mother. A spring there reminded this friar of the tears that she shed for her son, and so she named the town St. Monica or Santa Monica. There is an order of St. Augustine, which is a monastic order. It's dedicated to education, pastoral work, and social justice. And the current Pope, Pope Bob, I like to call him, he was from the Augustine, order. And so that's one of the things you have there. There's about a dozen colleges named St. Augustine. I said, I know I've heard of a St. Augustine. I said, where is it? And I pulled it up and found about a dozen of them that I could find. There may be more, all right? He is one of 39 doctors of the Roman Catholic Church, and there's certain things that require, basically a doctor of the Roman Catholic Church means that you have contributed to the teaching of that church, all right? And so he's one of 39 of that, and so that's a pretty exclusive club that he's in there. He's also one of the founding fathers of the Roman Catholic Church, along with Jerome, Gregory the Great, and Ambrose. And so if you're doing the Mount Rushmore of Roman Catholic fathers, basically, he's probably the George Washington of their Mount Rushmore, which I tried to find a picture of that too, and I couldn't get one. So if somebody that's really bright and creative, they can go do that and probably make $1 million selling the Mount Rushmore of the founding fathers. Let's talk a little about his theological legacy. He basically invented this. It's called ecclesiology, which is the study of the church. What is the church about? You ever just asked that question? Because I've asked this question. And I said, and I want to do a lesson sometimes, when you say the church, what do you mean, the church? It's obviously not a building, even though sometimes we'll say we're going to the church and we're talking about a church building, or it's up at the church, and that's one of the things, so that's not obviously what you're talking about there. You're talking about it's the people, all right? But you can go beyond that. Well, it's the organization. What is the church? And so you can get into it. He's done extensive writing on what is the church, that you can do that. Evil, which I got, when I was preparing this lesson, I kind of got into this thing and started listening to some stuff about evil and free will, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. And you have to sit there and say, so what is evil? If I was pressing you to define what is evil tonight, if you were like me, you probably would have come up with something kind of wishy-washy, because you can say, well, it's, anybody want to give it a chance? And so you go like, oh, okay, you have to go back in and do some really mind-bending thinking to determine what evil is. He described it this way. If he had a cloth, he said, because here's the thing, here's the question. If God created everything, did he create evil? All right. Everybody looks around and go like, good question, because if he didn't, then God didn't create everything, right? So if he didn't create evil, so you go, well, what is evil? That's when you need to define it. And so Augustine described it as a couple of things. One is he said it's like a cloth, and a cloth has a hole in it. God, think about this, God created the cloth whole, but the hole gets ripped, or something gets ripped, and now it's not perfect anymore. And sin basically takes what was perfect and rips that. And that's what we would call evil. It's the absence of good. It's the absence of being together. Another illustration that they used was a tree. And if you go out and look at a tree and the tree's growing, it's healthy, but then it gets a disease in it. All right. So the disease is what's evil. All right. So the tree is good, but the disease in it is evil. And we can get into more. And that might be one of the things that Kat wants to talk about on a Saturday or something like that. So we'll get more into that. So I was fascinated to do that. Well, Augustine, he went through all that, and he is a rhetorician, and he will persuade you to what evil is. And it's a fascinating topic. Original sin. Now, I want to make a point that this is not inherited sin from Adam, but this is the corrupted nature. And I've talked to my wife about that, because I said, I'm not sure if I believe in original sin in that sense, in the sense of what I thought it was. All right. So, because it leads to some interesting, leads down some interesting roads depending on what you believe about original sin. But his thing about original sin is it is that corrupted nature. So when Adam and Eve, basically Eve, they partake of the fruit, all of a sudden we're all going to die. We have a corrupted nature. That is original sin. Who's going to save us from our corrupted nature? Only Jesus Christ. Predestination. Again, he had a little different thought on predestination than what I would maybe believe. He said that basically God orders all things while preserving human freedom, and I would absolutely agree with that. My view on predestination is, and I'm going to pick somebody here. Jesse, you're going to work tomorrow, right? You are predestined to go to work. Do you have the ability to not go to work? Jesse nods his head, yes. And so he has the free will not to go to work. But if Jesse fulfills his destiny of going to work, the company functions, they make money, problems get solved, and life is better, right? And so that's it. God has a predestined plan for every one of us, all right? And so you start thinking about that. Now, do we have a choice of conforming to that plan? Absolutely, we have a choice. What happens when we don't? Well, that's corrupted. That's evil. And so you think about that, and that gets to be a very interesting thought and discussion about that. So Augustine, and by the way, nobody is thinking this way in the late 4th century. He is blazing trails and deep trails that nobody's even thinking about. Sacramental theology, the presence of Christ in communion, and boy, you can get people going on that, especially the Catholics. All right, they'll get going on that and talk about that, becoming the body of Christ, and others will say, well, no, Christ's body is in heaven, and they're not doing that, and let's have a few fights about it. And basically, that's one of the things that split the Eastern Church from the Western Church much later. He argues for infant baptism. All right, I don't buy into that, but we could talk about that later on. But that's part of his, also the original sin and some other things like that. Just war theory. When is it acceptable to go to war? And he comes out and he's got 3 points about that, and he belabors those on. And it's a very interesting thought. Nobody's thinking about that. But with the fall of Rome, and you have, again, at one point in time, the Vandals are basically outside the city gates. And so when is it right for a Christian to fight? Interesting question that you get into. What I think some of his best writing is on grace and free will. And he basically takes Paul's teaching on grace. For it is by grace that you've been saved through faith. And this is not of yourself. It's the gift of God. And you talk about what is the gift of God, and you can say it's, but at some point it's grace. And what does grace do for us? And his thinking on that was so far ahead of his time. It's just crazy. One guy, I think it was a Presbyterian guy, said the Reformation was nothing more than the Catholics and the Protestants arguing about Augustine's writings. And there's a lot of truth in that. I would ask, but I'm recording this so you don't hear it. But I was going to ask Keith to give me his favorite Augustinian quote. I'm going to give you a few that I picked out. All right, that I really love these. There is no saint without a past and no sinner without a future. Isn't that all of us, guys? Pray, you've heard this one, pray as though everything depended on God. Work as though everything depended on you. I can just get the rest of that up there. The world is a book, and those who do not travel read only one page. There's a good benefit in traveling and seeing the world. In absence of justice, what is sovereignty but organized robbery? And he was really battling with Roman, basically the Roman government there. And he says, basically, all you do is rob people if you don't give justice. And that's some truth there. Faith is to believe what you do not see. The reward of faith is to see what you believe. I'll let you think about that one. Read again. Faith is to believe what you do not see. The reward of faith is to see what you believe. Beautiful. See the rhetoric that comes out of that? Right is right even if no one's doing it. Wrong is wrong even if everyone's doing it. Good thing to put on your kids' doors. Hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and the courage to see that they do not remain as they are. The measure of love is to love without measure. You see how he turns those things? You can hear that come through. I love this one. Love begins with a smile, grows with a kiss, and ends with a teardrop. I'll let that sink in for a second. Okay. And then this may be my favorite one. Lord, you have made us for yourself, or you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. And I would invite you, if you have a restless heart, where you go to seek help. That's beautiful, beautiful saying. Aurelius Augustinus, he resigned as bishop in 427. He died at age 75 in Hippo. May he rest in peace. Questions or comments? Oh man, we finished right on time. A little early. All right. What's that? Keith's favorite quote. Come up here. You're going to have to.
You'll have to ask my wife.
Okay.
She's confused.
Okay. Robin, say it again to me. Okay. We don't want to have an argument here. Let's.
No, that's St. Francis.
Okay. Misquoted. Wrong person. We can do St. Francis. What did St. Francis say?
He was reputed to have said, preach the word, preach the word, preach the word, and when necessary, use words.
Okay, so if you didn't hear that recorded, he said, preach the word, preach the word, preach the word. And if necessary, use words. Close enough? All right, so a good quote. Thoughts, comments about Augustine?
From the audience.
Okay.
Kane Foster has a confession. He thinks you look more and more like the Santa Claus from, like Tim Allen's Santa Claus.
Okay. Is that a confession?
Chris Wilson says Matthew McConaughey would have been better than Owen Wilson.
Okay, Matthew McConaughey better than Owen Wilson.
Chris Foster says regarding the tree, what created the disease? I see evil as the absence of God. You must believe in God in order to understand evil.
Okay, so that's Chris?
It's Chris Foster.
So Chris wants to know what created the disease. Well, I don't have an answer to that. go read, go read Augustine. He'll tell you. Yeah, I don't know if you heard. So there's a few comments. Let me. Okay, we like what Chris said, but Cain, you're trying to confess my sins. Okay, I'm missing something.
No, right here. Just
Yeah. So Chris said, "What about the tree? What created disease? I see evil as the absence of God. You must believe in God to understand evil." And that is exactly right. And that's what he says. So evil, when you really get down to it, evil is the absence of God. It's like the garment that is torn. That hole is evil. It's the absence of the whole garment. And so that's what he would teach on that. Okay, so yeah, I see who are this about me being Santa Claus, looking like Tim Allen. And then any confessions, okay, this is a good comment. Any confessions should be made to the elders. No guarantees of absolution can be made. And that is a very good comment. If you talk about confessions, I would tell you that confessions is good. All right. And you need to have somebody you trust, somebody that's going to love you regardless of what you've done, and steer you in the right direction. And there are time for confessions, and there are good things to confess. I don't believe that, and I agree with that there is no absolution, that I don't grant absolution, and neither does a priest, and neither does anybody else. Only God grants absolution. All right. The confession is to help you share that burden with somebody else because of what you've done wrong. The best one to confess it to is the one that you may have harmed, if appropriate. All right. And there are times when even that might not be something that you want to wade into, but you can get into all sorts of things about the theory and thoughts of confessions. But confessions is good. I will do a plug for our men's group. We have shared some great confessions, and we love each other. And what happens on Thursday night or Tuesday morning stays on Thursday night, stays on Tuesday morning, and we want to hold to that. By the way, I'll make this other thing is, when you confess, you don't confess somebody else's sin. You know what that's called? Gossip. Yeah, you don't go over and say, by the way, just going to tell everybody, Jesse did da. No, I can't confess Jesse's sin. All right. Now, I may tell that to my wife or somebody else like that, but that's not what it is. That's for Jesse to confess. And anytime that gets beyond that, it becomes basically gossip. And that's one of the things that James.
What was Pelagianism and why was he so vehement against it?
Okay, so Pelagius, I think I am going to cover Pelagianism next week. All right. So next week, basically, what I really want to hit is Jerome and the history of the Bible, but I think I'm going to add Pelagianism because he helps to define a lot of Augustine's teaching. But Pelagius basically, he was a very popular teacher in Rome and had a big following, and a lot of what he would teach got led down the road to where he's saying you can be saved by works. And that's what probably the gist of his teaching would be, that you can be saved by works. Now, let me hang on to that for next week because there gets to be a lot more into that. I will say this about Pelagius. I think he gets a bad rap. He was a British monk or priest or something like that, and we don't really know a lot about him. We do know that a lot of things got attributed to Pelagius that he may or may not have ever said. So in other words, once you got on the bandwagon, like we're going to beat this guy up, then they got on the bandwagon and beat the guy up. He was eventually condemned and as a heretic, and he went out to the eastern part of, he's like in the east of Jerusalem, out in that area, and basically that's kind of the last you hear of him. But his teaching, there's still things of his teaching that I would probably adhere to. He would be, when we get into next spring, we'll talk about Calvinism and we'll talk about Arminianism. And Calvinism is going to draw a lot of stuff right out of Augustine. All right, and I know I'm kind of getting ahead of things. Arminianism talks about free will and some other things like that, and they will draw some from Pelagius, but then they'll also draw things from Augustine because he taught about free will as well. So that's just a thumbnail of Pelagius, but we'll probably give you, I think there's about 10 or 12 points that Pelagius that we can get into. Okay, with that, we are going to end, unless there's anything else. So thank you for being here tonight. We have some guests, Jack and Lacey are here, and enjoyed that. James is here live. He's watched everything, and it's good to have you with us tonight.